Today we have some more actual history about the early days of the American Republic. The story we will read today took place in Washington County, Virginia in 1785, when the home of Mrs. Frances Scott was attacked by Indians during the night. We will be reading from this book, Incidents of Border Life by Jospeh Pritts. This book was published all the way back in 1838. We have been reading from this book a lot on this channel lately, and this episode is a special edition for our Patreon and YouTube channel members only. It is titled, A Narrative of the Captivity and Escape of Frances Scott of Washington County, Virginia. So here is the tragic, bittersweet tale of Mrs. Frances Scott. On Wednesday, the 29th of June, 1785, late in the evening, a large company of armed men passed the house, on their way to Kentucky, some part of whom encamped within 2 miles. Mr. Scott, living on a frontier part, generally made the family watchful, but on this calamitous day, after so large a body of men had passed, shortly after night he lay down in his bed, and imprudently left one of the doors of his house open. The children were also in bed and asleep. Mrs. Scott was nearly undressed when, to her unutterable astonishment and horror, she saw rushing in through the door that was left open, painted savages with presented arms, raising a hideous shriek. Mr. Scott, being awake, instantly jumped out of his bed, but was immediately fired at. He forced his way through the middle of the enemy and got out the door, but fell a few paces from thence. An Indian seized Mrs. Scott and ordered her to a particular spot, and not to move. Others stabbed and cut the throats of the 3 youngest children in their bed, and afterwards lifted them up and dashed them down on the floor, near the mother. The eldest, a beautiful girl of 8 years old, awoke, escaped out of the bed, ran to her parents, and with the most plaintive accents cried, "Oh, Mama, Mama, save me!" The mother, in the deepest anguish of spirit, and with a flood of tears, entreated the savages to spare her child. But with a brutal fierceness, they tomahawked and stabbed her in the mother's arms. Adjacent to Mrs. Scott's dwelling house another family lived, of the name of Ball. The Indians also attacked them at the same instant they did Mr. Scott's, but the door being shut, the enemy fired into the house through an opening between 2 logs, and killed a young lad. They then essayed to force the door open, but a surviving brother fired through the door, and the enemy desisted and went off. The remaining part of the family ran out of the house and escaped. In Mr. Scott's house were 4 good rifles, well loaded, and a good deal of clothing and furniture, part of which belonged to people that had left it on their way to Kentucky. The Indians loaded themselves with the plunder, being 13 in number, then speedily made off, and continued traveling all night. Next morning their chief allotted to each man his share, and detached 9 of the party to steal horses from the inhabitants on Clinch. The 11th day after Mrs. Scott's captivity, the 4 Indians that had her in charge stopped at a place fixed upon for a rendezvous and to hunt. Being now in great want of provisions, 3 went out, and the chief, being an old man, was left to take care of the prisoner, who by this time expressed a willingness to proceed on to the Indian towns, which seemed to have the desired effect of lessening her keeper's vigilance. In the daytime, as the old man was graining a deerskin, the captive, pondering her situation, and anxiously looking for an opportunity to make her escape, took the resolution and went to the Indian carelessly, asked liberty to go a small distance to a stream of water, to wash the blood off her apron that had remained there since the fatal night of the murder of her little daughter. He told her in the English tongue, "Go along." She then passed by him, his face being in a contrary direction from that she was going, and he very busy. She, after getting to the water, proceeded on without delay, made to a high barren mountain, and traveled until late in the evening, when she came down into the valley in search of the track she had taken along, hoping thereby to find the way back, without the risk of being lost and perishing with hunger in uninhabited parts. On coming across the valley to the riverside, she observed in the sand the tracks of 2 men that had gone up the river and had just returned. She concluded these to have been her pursuers, which excited emotions of gratitude and thankfulness to divine providence for so timely a deliverance. Being without any provisions, having no kind of weapon or tool to assist her in getting any, and being almost destitute of clothing, and knowing that a vast tract of rugged high mountains intervened between where she was and the inhabitants eastwardly, the distance of the Kentucky settlements unknown, almost as ignorant as a child of the method of steering through the woods, it may well be supposed to have excited painful sensations, but certain death either by hunger or wild beasts seemed preferable to being in the power of wretches who had excited in her mind such horror. She addressed heaven for protection, and taking courage proceeded onward. After traveling 3 days, she had nearly met with the Indians, as she supposed, that had been sent to Clinch to steal horses, but providentially hearing their approach, concealed herself among the cane until the enemy had passed. This giving a fresh alarm, and her mind being filled with consternation, she got lost, proceeding backwards and forwards for several days. At length she came to a river that seemed to come from the east. Concluding it was Sandy River, she resolved to trace it to its source, which is adjacent to the Clinch settlements. After proceeding up the same several days, she came to where the river runs through the great Laurel Mountain, where there is a prodigious waterfall and numerous high, craggy cliffs along the water's edge. That way seemed impassable, the mountain steep and difficult. However, our unhappy traveler concluded that the latter way was the best. She therefore ascended for some time, but coming to a range of inaccessible rocks, she turned her course towards the foot of the mountain and the riverside. After getting into a deep gully and passing over several high, steep rocks, she reached the riverside where, to her inexpressible affliction, she found that a perpendicular rock, or rather one that hung over of 15 or 20 feet high, formed the bank. Here a solemn pause took place. She essayed to return, but the height of the steeps and rocks she had passed over prevented her. She then returned to the edge of the precipice, and viewed the bottom of it, as the certain spot to end all her troubles, to remain on top to pine away with hunger, or be devoured by wild beasts. After serious meditation and devout exercises, she determined on leaping from the heights, and accordingly jumped off. Although the place she had to alight was covered with uneven rocks, not a bone was broken, but being exceedingly stunned by the fall, she remained unable to proceed for some space of time. The dry season caused the river to be shallow. She traveled in it where she could, by its edge until she got through the mountain, which she concluded was several miles. After this, as she was traveling along the bank of the river, a venomous snake bit her on the ankle. She had strength to kill it, and knowing its kind, concluded that death must soon overtake her. By this time Mrs. Scott was reduced to a mere skeleton with fatigue, hunger, and grief. Probably this state of her body was the means of preserving her from the effects of the poison. Be that as it may, very little pain succeeded the bite, and what little swelling there was fell into her feet. Our wanderer now left the river, and after proceeding a good distance, she came to where the valley parted into two, each leading a different course. Here a painful suspense again took place. A forlorn creature, almost exhausted, and certain that if she was led far out of the way, she would never see a human creature. During these reflections, a beautiful bird passed close by her, fluttering along the ground, and went out of sight up one of the valleys. This drew her attention, and whilst considering what it might mean, another bird of the same appearance in like manner fluttered past her, and took the same valley the other had done. This determined her choice of the way, and in 2 days, which was the 11th of August, she reached that settlement on Clinch called New Garden, whereas she is since informed by Woodman, had she taken the other valley, it would have led her back towards the Ohio. Mrs. Scott relates that during her wandering from the 10th of July to the 11th of August, she had no other subsistence but chewing and swallowing the juice of young cane stalks, sassafras leaves, and some other plants she did not know the names of, that on her journey she saw buffaloes, elks, deer, and frequently bears and wolves, not one of which, although some passed very near her, offered to do her the least harm. One day a bear came near her with a young fawn in his mouth, and on discovering her he dropped his prey and ran off. Hunger prompted her to go and take the flesh and eat it, but on reflection she desisted, thinking that the bear might return and devour her. Besides, she had an aversion to raw flesh. Mrs. Scott continued in a low state of health, and remained inconsolable for the loss of her family, particularly bewailing the cruel death of her little daughter. So that's it for this episode about the capture and escape of Mrs. Frances Scott. Although the story mentioned that the Scotts had several loaded rifles in their home, her husband was apparently unable to make use of them to defend his family. This story is one that I haven't been able to find much additional information on outside of this book. It is unclear what type of snake bit Mrs. Scott during the many days that it took her to make her escape. My guess is that it was either a rattlesnake or a copperhead. A copperhead bite is usually less deadly than a rattlesnake's, and they also account for more snake bites in the US, so my guess is that she was bit by a copperhead. As the story mentioned at the end, Frances Scott was extremely distraught after her entire family had been killed, including her husband Archibald Scott. However, it appears that she did remarry a man named Thomas Johnson, and they had 4 kids: Mary Johnson Sewell, born in 1788, Henry Dickinson Johnson, born in 1792. His middle name, Dickinson, was the maiden name of Frances Scott. He may have been a twin to his sister Elizabeth Johnson, also born in 1792. Their last child, Thomas Johnson Jr., was born in 1793. Sadly, Frances Dickinson Scott Johnson died in 1796, when she was only around 40 years old. Thank you for watching this special edition of Unworthy History for our Patreon and YouTube channel members only. And thank you for your continued support of the channel and our mission to keep actual history alive by reading directly from old books. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.